Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Textual Awakening Podcast. In each episode, we try to delve deep into the most profound books and ideas of our time in order to gain wisdom and live a more fulfilling life. My name is Jake Taylor, and I will be your host. As an aside, before the next video of my Marx vs. Zion series is finished, I'd like to explain a tool that I use when engaging with any sort of moral, political, or ideological claim. So, when engaging with a text or idea that proposes any unique claims, I ask myself, what are the assumptions being made in this assertion? Especially with an ideology like Marxism and its contemporary Marxian variants, this is usually an effective way to make sure that you are not being persuaded of something that you don't actually agree with. So political leftists are by and large highly persuasive within their own ideological framework, just in my own personal experience. They make good cases within the structure that they give themselves, the rhetorical structure. It's a sort of boxing ring of assumptions that seems to silently rise from the ground, and it makes it difficult to go all 12 rounds in a verbal sparring match with a leftist who really knows what they're talking about. Any good debater will use similar tactics of setting the terms of a discussion, but leftists are particularly good in this, in my experience, which to me explains how modern leftism has gained so much traction, even in something like the modern capitalist corporation, which theoretically should be opposed to leftist thought, but nonetheless goes along with a lot of it nowadays because the terms are set. The axioms and the suppositions are so firmly in place that they are difficult to question and even realize that they're there. So the trick is to take apart the boxing ring itself, showing up front what the unquestioned axioms are before mounting a rebuttal to whatever the claim itself is. So, as an example of this process, I'm going to be referring to a quote from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. I think it's philosophic. I apologize. It's written by Karl Marx. A lot of these essays were written early in his life, in his 20s, but the collection was published posthumously after his death. So the first half of this quote is as follows. The less you eat, drink, buy books, go to the theater or to balls, or to the pub, and the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, fence, etc., the more you will be able to save, and the greater will become your treasure, which neither moth nor rust will corrupt, your capital. So first, I need to give the devil his due. In my opinion, this critique of acquiring money at the expense of lived experience rings true more today, and personally I think, than even it did in Marx's time when he wrote it. Just think of movies like Fight Club or Office Space or any of the myriad popular movies that kind of denigrate the accrual of wealth at the expense of your quality of life, and the trap that puts you in personally. Giving over your soul simply for more capital will ultimately result in a devaluation of life itself, something which Marx described with persuasive force. So that being said, some key assumptions are being made that tilt the persuasive power of the quote in one direction instead of many other directions that it could have gone. So not everyone who works for money has the scarcity mindset that every morsel of pleasure or self-expression must be rejected in order to acquire more capital. My question is, what of the entrepreneur? What of the person whose productive vision is what generates value for the world and therefore brings him money? So, first, one of the major assumptions Marx made in this quote is that self-sacrifice is the sole means of acquiring capital in one's lifetime. While this is clearly a way of acquiring money over time, among many, it is most certainly not the greatest way of acquiring quote-unquote treasure, as Marx puts it, not even close. So in a book called The Motivation Myth by Jeff Hayden, the author himself delves into the public access IRS records, not a glamorous pursuit by any means, but he did it in order to discover exactly how the wealthiest Americans made their fortunes. Aside from generational wealth, which made up a surprisingly small amount of the people, surprisingly small percentage, basically every single one of the top earners that Jeff Hayden found in his tedious research earned their money in two related ways. One, they started and grew a successful business, or 2, they gained ownership shares of an existing business, and which then grew during their period of ownership, like an investor or someone who becomes partner at a company without having to invest in it themselves. So with very few exceptions, that was it. That is how people make massive amounts of wealth. Certainly, entrepreneurship requires sacrifice of time, effort, and capital, but the penny pinching that Marx described simply isn't the way that true wealth is acquired. Producing wealth and producing value for other people is how money is made on a large scale. So, of course, frauds exist, and they make their fortunes from deceit. This is true. However, that doesn't belittle the honest pursuit of value production as a means of growing wealth while improving the lives of others. And this is a stark contrast to Marx's assertion that it's simply rejecting good food, leisure activities, creative pursuits, because you can integrate those into an entrepreneurial venture as long as it's adding value to people's lives. But returning to the concept of fraud, so just because Bernie Madoff and Elizabeth Holmes exist, it doesn't negate the fact that most successful entrepreneurs make their money because they found innovative ways of solving real problems for people in a valuable way. So the outliers and extremists do not represent the majority of any group, wealthy people included. Not every person who believes in the Book of Mormon is like Warren Jeffs, and Christianity should not be dismantled simply because of the legacy of Jim Jones. So another assumption that Marx makes in this quoted passage is that you can either eat, drink, buy books, go to the theater, etc., or gain capital. As it's described, it's an inverse relationship, like a seesaw, where in order to make your bank balance go up, your quality of life must go down. So what if the way that you make your money is by critiquing books or theater performances, or by painting, or by singing, or whatever? So in a subtle act of conflation, Marx slips the word love into this quote as well, as if in order to save money, one must sacrifice the capacity to love, which simply isn't true. This might seem like a pithy quip, but it serves the purpose of showing that assumptions are being made as to the relationship of creative endeavors and making money that are half-truths at best. So every persuasive claim contains some truth, and it's up to us as readers to discern where the truth stops and where the assumptions and beliefs silently begin, and try to bridge the gap between the author's desired conclusions and what actually is true and what works. So a third and crucial assumption that Marx puts forward in this quote is that capital cannot be corrupted nor destroyed. Admittedly, this may have been said tongue-in-cheek because, he obviously doesn't like religion and he's quoting the Bible in a slant way here. But for the sake of analysis, I feel the need to state the obvious that wealth in all of its forms actually can be corrupted and destroyed. Inflation, interest on debt, a bet gone wrong on the stock exchange, the bank you frequent goes under, albeit post-2008, the likelihood of that happening is actually lower now, but I digress. Someone steals from you, an irresponsible heir or financial planner burns up your inheritance and your money, the unavoidable clutches of the Internal Revenue Service. These are all examples of how wealth can be corrupted or destroyed. So particularly with a bad investment, the money truly is destroyed. It doesn't come back. Money lost in bankruptcy, in a bankrupt business or a business that's lost value, it's gone because the value's gone. And most investments like that aren't tied to concrete assets like property, which even if it's tied to property, the value can go down, but rather the promise of future profits. Some forms of capital do resist devaluation with more robustness, such as harder assets like precious metals, machinery, and yes, large amounts of money are more difficult to permanently lose than small amounts of money. But to say that capital doesn't rust or corrupt is an assumption of terms that isn't as ironclad as Marx makes it out to be. So these are just 3 assumptions from this small quote, just half the quote, and certainly there are more, but it demonstrates the point that unless you take the time to purposefully question what the presuppositions of any claim are, they can sneak under the radar and they trap you in this invisible boxing ring that you might not have agreed to enter in the first place. Now I want to take a closer look at the second part of the quote, which is as follows. The less you are, the less you express your life. The more you have, the greater is your alienated life, and the greater is the savings of your alienated being. So this half of the quote immediately carries a much heavier moral weight than the first half did. Aside from the assumption that self-abasement and a scarcity mindset is how capital is accrued over time instead of value added to the economy, Marx assumes that self-sacrifice and in and of itself makes you less of a person. Note that in the quote. Directly after the things that you sacrifice, it's the less you are, the less you express your life, etc. So the less you are slips right in there after that last sentence about not drinking, eating, reading books, etc. The act of not pursuing pleasure, leisure activities, and creative endeavors is directly associated with being less of a person, less yourself. So this presupposition may easily pass unexamined and unquestioned, and it's simultaneously partly true and also a very low resolution take on self-sacrifice in the pursuit of capital. So first, to give the devil his due, there is something to be said of a loss or life lost in the pursuit of money, like we talked about earlier a little bit. This is largely because what actually makes us happy over time as human beings aren't things that money can buy. We crave friendship, a sense of community, the feeling of purpose that comes from being needed and wanted in some real capacity by those around us. If Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone can teach us anything, it's that if you want a happy life, make time for family cohesion, friendship building, and community interaction, particularly if the group that you're interacting with is intergenerational, or in other words, has people of diverse ages and also backgrounds as well. Money can certainly add to our life satisfaction. There are infinite experiences that the world has to offer that are positive, many amazing and rewarding, and money gives you access to many of those experiences. Also, in the reverse direction, not having enough money will inevitably place a heavy load on your mind and body. Poverty is not favorable, and they say that with more money comes more problems. And this is true, but also not being able to pay your rent is certainly a much more pressing problem than being pestered by a random past acquaintance who wants to be close to you all of a sudden because you're rich. So that being said, the baseline happiness and meaning that all people crave is by its very nature not able to be found in the explicit pursuit of wealth. Happiness and meaning are byproducts of an integrated life full of depth in relationships to oneself, one's family, one's friends, and one's broader community. We may want a new car in our life, but we need relationships. We really do need them. The health effects of a lack of social connectedness are substantial and backed by a lot of research. Again, turn to Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. Now, returning to Marx's quote. After that aside, I hope it's evident that in a very real way, the explicit pursuit of capital above all else will lead to life dissatisfaction. To quote Deuteronomy, man shall not live on bread alone, and we all need more than money to have a satisfying life. That being said, the reason behind seeking wealth will greatly determine whether or not the self-sacrifice Marx described will result in a degrading or an edifying experience, because context always matters. Sometimes it is necessary to sacrifice personal comforts and aspirations, and time, and as well as your time, to earn more money. Is this always a bad thing? Of course, a balance has to be struck to avoid a life filled with work but devoid of relationships and purpose. But what of the father who sacrifices his aspirations of being a better musician so that he has more time available when balancing work and family obligations? What of the mother who, forced by financial hardship, goes out for food and drinks less often with her family and friends so that she can save enough money for future expenses like medical bills, housing payments, groceries, etc.? These are strict calculations which trade personal happiness for money. They also, in my opinion, contradict Marx's claim that self-sacrifice in the pursuit of capital by its nature makes one less of a person, less of oneself. These examples are not unique, and similar situations play themselves out all around us all the time, in our own lives and in the lives of people around us. So do such sacrifices make any of us less as people? Most certainly not, I would say. Again, balance is necessary to keep a sense of self intact, but money itself is not an evil thing. I suppose that Marx would assert that in the communist society, after socialism has worked out all the contradictions, that these hypothetical people would have their needs met and wouldn't need to sacrifice their aspirations to take care of themselves and their families, economically speaking. This, in and of itself, is an enormous assumption, one that has not played out well throughout history. So, I would be remiss if I passed over the most glaring assumption that Marx makes in this passage, which is the concept of Marxist alienation as a universal truism. So first I want to describe what Marx meant by alienation. These sorts of assumptions that are fundamental for an ideology are called axioms. So axioms are different from mere rhetorical presuppositions because they form the foundation upon which a system of belief builds itself upwards. So for Marxism, the concept of alienation as the separation of man's productive capacity and imagination from the products he creates is a central axiom that provides a driving reason for claims like the dissolution of private property. Giving one's own time and capabilities to fulfill another person's vision, i.e. as an employee for an employer, in order to acquire money is absolutely central to the rest of the revolutionary spirit of Marxism. Marxism's driving purpose is essentially to end society-wide alienation by reuniting man's productive capacity to his own subjective imagination and control. In order to accomplish this, he must be liberated from constraints of moral, economic, religious, and social impositions, which is the ultimate goal of communism. Thus, alienation is indeed a central axiom for the Marxist view of life and history, which Marx describes as the unending progress steps towards communism. All roads lead towards communism for Marx. Now, alienation is a slippery topic to address. It is a sensation that I personally have felt, and I think a lot of people do. For me, it's a sense that my life isn't my own, that my energy is being spent to prop up a machine of production I don't necessarily support or agree with. I felt this way going to college, and particularly for creative and independent-minded people, moving forward in the conventional path of school, work, investment in an IRA, hopefully retirement, and all of that will inevitably leave people feeling suffocated. Where Marx goes wrong, in my opinion, with the concept of alienation is that he uses it as an impetus for broad social revolution instead of individual responsibility for psychological integration, and also for religious and spiritual adherence, which I think they go hand in hand. Psychological integration and adherence to a religious creed, I think, at some level are inseparable, and someday I'll go into that a bit more. So tearing down society writ large is by no means the only way for people struggling with a sense of alienation to regain control of their creative efforts. It is a way to attempt this reconciliation, right along with entrepreneurship, materialist minimalism, so rejecting personal possessions, and luxury goods, successful psychotherapy, and strictly following a schedule that includes time for achieving personal goals and maintaining health, mental and physical and spiritual health. So that being said, from my understanding, no Marxist revolution has ever resulted in the large-scale flourishing of the human spirit to create, invent, and imagine. It is simply assumed in the Marxist creed that when done correctly, a proletarian revolution will result in the elimination of alienation. In this way, Marx thought that he was being descriptive of future history instead of prescriptive. That these proletarian revolutions would spontaneously occur all around the world, resulting in the destruction of the capitalist hegemony and the institution of a global socialist state would just happen naturally. History bears us contrary evidence. This didn't happen. Maybe that is a good indication that this assumption that alienation from one's own labor must be reconciled through revolution is wrong. In sum, even a small quote like this one that I've dissected today can be filled with assumptions, assumed definitions, moral stances, and false dichotomies. In the pursuit of a true textual awakening, where we as a society engage honestly with the powerful books and ideas of our day, it is absolutely imperative that we take the time to identify what assumptions are being made in any given argument. Take down the invisible boxing ring and do not take axiomatic presuppositions as given fact. Often, ideological axioms are unfalsifiable claims, statements that cannot be proven nor disproven with any level of certainty. This is fine if such axioms are admitted and do not cause harm to other people, such as the axiom of faith in the Christian belief. That faith in God is not something that can be explicitly proven or disproven. It is an axiom that is the fundamental layer upon which Christianity and many other religions are built. However, if the axiom is in question is akin to Marxist alienation, which by its very nature demands social revolution to resolve itself, then it is our duty as intellectual explorers to identify those presuppositions and bring them into the light of scrutiny. We cannot let these assumptions just pass by unnoticed and unquestioned. At the very least, it is important for us, each of us personally, to identify rhetorical and axiomatic assumptions so that we don't wind up going along with a movement, ideology, or system of beliefs that we actually oppose. It actually opposes what we think of as morally correct, because that does happen. It happened all through the 20th century. So with that in mind, make sure to keep your eyes open and your mind sharp and awake. As always, thank you for joining the Textual Awakening. Consider subscribing if you like this video and leave a comment, preferably a polite one, if you have any thoughts or suggestions. I am your host, Jake Taylor. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.